Welcome to our monthly hazardous webinar series, where we take a closer look at one of Natural Hazard Research Australia's research projects, its findings, and how it will be translated into practice with members of the project team and the people who will use the research. My name's Nicola Moore, and I'm one of the Node research managers with the Centre, and I'm based in our Brisbane office. But before we commence, I'd like to acknowledge that we are all gathered from across a range of different Aboriginal lands today. I am a guest here on the Yuggera Turrbal lands in Meanjin, Brisbane, as I am wherever I walk in Australia, because sovereignty has never been ceded. And I pay my respects to the Yuggera Turrbal elders, past, present and emerging, and also to any First Nations people joining us online today. These lands and waters across our country have always been places of teaching, research and learning. And First Nations people have long looked after and cared for country as kin and continue to do so today. We can all play a key role in dismantling the ongoing processes of colonisation by supporting Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people on this journey. After all, we all share the same fundamental goal, and that is resilient and sustainable landscapes and communities and everything in between. So thank you all for joining us today. Today's panel session will be recorded, and a link to it and any other presentation materials will be made available in the coming weeks to you. Please let us know if you are having any technical problems by adding the details into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and our team will help troubleshoot any issues with you. Your questions will be answered at the end of the formal panel presentation, so please add any questions as we go along to that Q&A function, making sure that you specify who your question is for, and we'll get to them in the last 15 minutes, sorry. Yeah. So I'd like to introduce you to our panellists today. First up, we have Professor Jabulkowski, Paula, and Paula is a professor in strategy at the University of Queensland. Paula is a global expert in the public-private mechanisms proliferating around the world to address the insurance protection gap. And the insurance protection gap is the economic loss from catastrophic events that is not insured. In advanced economies, the burden for paying for recovery from disasters then falls upon government and taxpayers. And in low-income countries, disaster recovery can set back economic gains by decades, affecting the lives and livelihoods of vulnerable people. Currently, Paula is researching how we can reconfigure the insurance market around sharing the risk of climate change with a particular Australian focus on flood and cyclone risk, and how innovations in disaster risk financing, such as disaster liquidity insurance, can be used to support climate adaptation and response. We also have joining us Dr. Katie Meisner, a postdoctorate research fellow in the University of Queensland's Business School. Katie's key research areas of interest lie in the fields of insurance and protection gap entities, sustainability, environmental communication, stakeholder communication and engagement processes. And prior to obtaining her PhD, Katie worked in communication roles across a variety of industries, including mining, transport, tourism and retail. We are also joined today by Veena Vasani from the Queensland Reconstruction Authority. And Veena is an accomplished senior executive who has a passion for delivering positive outcomes for Queenslanders. Veena had 10 years experience in corporate banking before transitioning to the state government sector 12 years ago. Motivated by delivering tangible and relatable outcomes, Veena thrives on seeing strategy and policy merge to create exceptional community results. And Veena joined the Reconstruction Authority in October 2022 in the role of General Manager, Resilience and Recovery. Veena oversees the Resilience and Recovery Policy and Program Design Unit, the Hazard and Risk Unit, which includes GIS, the Disaster Risk Management and Flood Risk Management, and the Voluntary Buyback Program. Veena's passionate about developing best practice, evidence-based strategies and policies to help communities be ready, resilient, and recover stronger from disaster events. We're also joined by Dan Kilpatrick from Queensland Reconstruction Authority. And Dan was the project manager for the voluntary buyback initiative under the Resilient Homes Fund. And since 2019, Dan has managed the delivery of a variety of resilient policy and infrastructure programs during his time at QRA. He has a master's in project management and is Prince 2 Foundation certified. And Dan is now the portfolio manager for all resilient funded programs in QRA. And we're also joined by Sam Boasted, the Director of Program Management Office and Technical Strategic Policy, the Resilient Homes Fund Disaster Resilient Program at the Queensland Department of Housing and Public Works. Sam plays a key role in the administration and implementation of the retrofit and raise components of the Resilient Homes Fund. He's passionate about using design thinking and design advocacy to create a better built and natural environment. He has a background in applied research and practice in resilient house design, is a passionate advocate for flood resilient housing. He's co-led the New York the Climate Brains Trust, at the World Economic Forum, bringing together 10 climate startups for round-table advice from experts. He's run workshops in Australia, the USA, Indonesia, Netherlands, and Switzerland. He graduated as the top Master of Architecture student at UQ, winning 5 of 9 graduate prizes, including the Australian Institute of Architects QIA medallion. He's also studied at the University of Technology in Berlin, the University of British Columbia, and the University of California in Berkeley. So welcome to all of our panellists. A little bit about this project. Post-disaster resilient housing programs, such as the Resilient Homes Fund in Queensland, have been adopted on the basis that investing in resilience measures in the home can significantly reduce the effort, time, and cost to recover from disasters. This webinar today will be the first in a series of ongoing research titled Evaluating the Resilient Homes Fund, a project that's co-funded by both NHRA and the Queensland Reconstruction Authority. The Resilient Homes Fund was established to provide Queenslanders whose homes were impacted by the 2022 floods with access to grants to raise, retrofit, or have their home voluntarily bought back. The research seeks to understand the success factors, lessons learnt as they link to physical, financial, social, and emotional resilience outcomes for individuals and communities. Given the events of the past few months in Queensland, this subject is very topical, and today's presentation and Q&A will focus solely on the first study package from this research, called Resilient Housing Policies, a Framework for Evaluation, where the research team looked at global post-disaster resilient housing programs and what they mean for Australia, how these initiatives function within their own social and environmental contexts to impact resilience at individual and community levels. So I'd like to hand over to our first panellist, Dr. Paula Jabrowski. Paula?
Thanks very much for that. I appreciate the shout out for all the great people who've helped us with getting this done. I'd just like to give a shout out to the team at UQ, Dr. Katie Meissner, Mr. Neil Taylor, Dr. Tyler Riordan, and Dr. Rosie Gallagher, who've all are working on this project and have helped with this particular report and framework development. So thanks for that. As Nicola pointed out, this isn't actually an evaluation of the Resilient Homes programs that we are seeing in Australia. It's a precursor to that, giving us some sort of benchmark for what we might expect. So as part of that, we looked first, we sort of sampled broadly, deciding to focus mostly on advanced economies because it would give us more relevant things to think about for Australia. So, countries where we have existing institutions and, robust disaster response type structures. Part of that, we looked at New Zealand, the UK, USA, and some programs that had occurred in Australia. We zoned down on 7 of these because they had something relevant to say about either buyback, some form of relocation or buyback, moving people away from a hazard, or because they engaged in some form of retrofit, so to change the design of a house to make it more robust to the hazard, or particularly in the case of flood, to raising. So we look at these, some of which have been fully completed, some of which are still ongoing, and we use them to generate a framework that I'm going to talk you through that we hope will be helpful for thinking about the things that we now face in Australia not only in Queensland, but a number of states are starting to roll out different kinds of packages as we see these ongoing sorts of disasters. I'm going to talk you through this framework, and there'll be plenty of time to ask questions at the end. So the first thing is just to think that these programs, when they are designed, are intended to change physical resilience to hazard. So the primary thing is to change something about the housing stock, either moving people away or changing that housing stock itself. And so that's the primary criteria on which they might typically be judged. However, we want to point out that any of these policies, when it's implemented, meets a very diverse set of conditions that need to be understood in order to evaluate that policy. So populations are diverse. Even the same policy is rolled out across people with very different financial, socioeconomic, and other forms of capability to engage with the program. Housing stock itself is very, very different. Hazards, even like a flood hazard, plays out in multiple different ways. It's not a single hazard almost. Plus, the scale and the complexity of these programs means that we need a broader definition of success than simply how many houses were fixed. Clearly, how many houses were fixed or had some sort of intervention is an important measure, but we need to look at these in a broader sense if we want to understand the spillover benefits of or some of the problems with implementing these programs. So the first thing we find is that to start any kind of program, you need a lot of data and information about who is affected. You might think that was an easy thing to do, but it turns out that it's quite complex to work out who was affected in what way and get those people registered quickly. We there find that those programs that already had a pre-existing framework for identifying people and the salience or the problem that the hazard might have caused those people and already knew something about their housing stock were in a better place to get going rather than those that had to start right from the beginning. And as part of that, what we see is that there are enablers to being able to get going quickly and to know who's affected and how to deal with them. So, because we can be talk about, registering literally thousands and thousands of people, or even in the US, hundreds of thousands of people for some form of intervention. So what we find is that if you have an existing system and database, which has the type of housing stock on it, the nature of the people in those areas and understands a lot already, has hazard maps and understands those well. And we see that that can happen where you have an existing policy that is currently being rolled out. So one of the cases in our report is North Carolina, and it looks at North Carolina through the 1990s, where they had repeat cyclones, or what we call cyclones, over a number of years. And because of that, they already had a program in place, which meant that as a new disaster happened, they were very easily able to ramp up and to use the material that they'd learned, the systems that they'd learned to register and get those people going. We also find that government insurance schemes, particularly compulsory ones, like we find in New Zealand with the Tokatu Ake Earthquake Commission, are very helpful because basically that insurance scheme owns the risk on all of the housing stock exposed to that hazard, which means that they know a great deal about, so what is the insurance base that we might have to help support movement? They know something about the stock because the housing stock, because insurance deals with that. So these kinds of things are all maybe not intended to support our resilient housing programs, but do lead to support. Whereas starting anew means setting up a whole database, working out where the people are, and a lot of that material is held in different kinds of places in government and in private sector. So basically, once you've got your thing going, however, it then leads to how do we make this work for the maximum number of people? And what we need to be aware of there is that this will never work for everybody. Any of these are very complex programs, and so we need to think along the lines of trade-offs. And a trade-off is essentially making a sacrifice in one area to benefit another area. Or you might think of it as a compromise, something we have to do to get this going. So we find that there are two key trade-offs. The first one is whether the program takes a collective approach, meaning that it zones a whole group of people or area for an intervention and then implements that in a standardized way across that whole area, or whether they take an individual house-by-house approach. And there are pros and cons to both of those. What we see, for example, in New Zealand is that it was a collective approach wherein after the Christchurch earthquakes, they red zoned an area, which allowed that whole area to be targeted for a collective approach to buyback, which was essentially largely a buyback and a very large scale buyback when we think about 7,900 properties being moved from a place. So taking a collective approach is obviously enabled where you already know a lot. So having a pre-existing framework, knowing where the zone is, can be very helpful to then target a large group of people and try to have an efficient approach to them. On the other hand, individual approaches are particularly valuable where you've got a voluntary approach where people you may be starting anew, people don't know anything about this program, and so they need time to understand what it means for them. The program implementers need to know what are the individual homes like, how will this program actually play out for the very different housing stock. What we found with Floodry, which is a UK government-based insurer that has implemented Build Back Better, which is essentially a flood retrofit program, is that it's very much individually based. It offers these possibilities for individuals to take it up. It's voluntary and it's actually not a post-disaster. It is based on houses that have been affected by disaster, but it is then aiming to work with those people who would like to make their houses more disaster proof prior to the next disaster. So where there's perhaps a little less urgency for the uptake, for example, in a pre-disaster situation, you might find that these individual approaches give people time to engage. So that's one of the trade-offs that you might need to consider in how does the programs you're looking at play out. The other is issues of eligibility and equity. And here fairness is a very subjective thing. But, eligibility essentially can be based simply on damage. If a place is damaged to a certain level, then it could be eligible for whatever the intervention is. And in New Zealand, that was a facilitated eligibility based on the damage zone. So it's collective approach. The eligibility is if you're in that zone and you've had that damage, you are eligible. And so it's not really dealing with issues of people at different levels of need for this, but as damage as a key criteria for starting to change the housing stock. But we can also find, and we're very aware of this, in fact, in a lot of the studies we look at, and not saying that those that do take an eligibility approach don't also look at equity, that people come with very different abilities to access these types of programs. We need to remember that some people live with pretty inconsistent access to technologies, and yet a lot of the registering, for example, needs to be done online, where these things are happening post-disaster, people's lives are disrupted, and those who are more vulnerable, for example, lower socioeconomic, or where they're in more precarious forms of housing, particularly post-disaster, they will struggle to, even if there's a lot of fairness in the eligibility to access inequity. And so we found that New Jersey very specifically targeted after Hurricane Sandy, which was a mass problem for the state of New Jersey, targeted low and medium income houses and those in multifamily housing on the premise that those were the people who would need more support in order to be able to access and make use of the program, and also may have less means of their own in order to become in a more resilient state. So these are just two of the main trade-offs we found, but obviously they interact with each other in terms of also how individually you take this. The more individual that you are, the more that you can also potentially consider equity issues for different individuals. One of the other things that always comes up when you look at these programs, and it's, often for people, they ask, well, we offered this, it was made available, people were eligible to help themselves. Why didn't they take it up? Why didn't more people make use of it? And this is what we find and call the mobilization problem. And so we need to remember that after most of these programs, only two of the programs that we looked at, which was the Brisbane Flood Resilient Homes Program. It was a pilot to make homes more resilient. So it was homes that had been flooded. So it was homes that had experienced disaster, the same thing with Floodry in the UK, but they were not post-disaster interventions. But when you're intervening post-disaster, we've got to remember that there's also recovery going on. A lot of people will be in really quite precarious housing, still trying to get kids to school, manage jobs, and potentially even living in very precarious forms of housing that are not really suitable. So there's lots of reasons why when we roll these out post-disaster, people struggle to mobilize themselves to access it given that the complexity of everyday life has also become more complex. So we call this mobilization, is also known as, in common parlance, why don't people do it? Generous offers are made. So some of the things, for example, that we find, it's important to put in place incentives, and one part of our report talks about these incentives. You may think that just giving people access to a fund is an incentive, and of course it is. It's great that we do see in these advanced economies these incentives, but also, for example, people may be reluctant to engage in buyback if all of that simply goes into securing, paying back their mortgage, or if that amount of money doesn't allow them to buy somewhere that also allows them to get to work, keep their kids in school, those kinds of things. So the New Jersey program actually worked with mortgage lenders and things to secure loan forgivenesses that would then help people to make more use of a buyback to get themselves into a better position. Because remember, why are we doing this? Well, we want to do it so people can get into a better position where they're more resilient to the next flood. Or the next hurricane or the next earthquake or fire. So thinking about these kinds of things in terms of, are there some things we might need to do to mobilize people? If they can't see themselves being more resilient, then that might be one of the reasons that they don't take up an initiative, or they simply struggle. So we find that things like some sorts of incentives to help them do that. Often we also find forms of support agencies plugged on. So support agencies that actually go out and work with those, particularly linking to the equity issue, work with those who struggle with equity issues to help them find maybe other small grants that will help them get into these programs, or that help them to do some of the form filling and so forth. We can imagine if, there are issues to do with internet access or to do with linguistic struggles, those things help as well. We also found that insurance incentives were helpful. So in Louisiana, and that's an ongoing program, it's the most recent one we looked at, reduced premiums, and keeping in mind that flood insurance is based through a state-based insurance program in the US, the National Flood Insurance Program, offering reduced premiums to those who engaged with the program, so supporting them in that way. So we think that it's important to move beyond just offering products, and we do know that that's a very important thing to considering. How do you then mobilize people to engage with these possibilities? And all of these then lead to, well, what's the outcome? Any policy that we see implemented is intended, as we note at the start, to increase physical resilience. And so we could simply measure, well, how many houses had an intervention of some sort, or how many people were moved. But there's a couple of things we need to keep in mind if we want to use that as a measure of success, which is, of course, that's an important measure. But what else happened, for example, in terms of getting people mobilized to take up this program? And then how do we know what effects it had? And that we can't know immediately, even if we're in a repeat disaster situation. So what's very important is this feedback loop. And we found that a feedback loop was an important thing to create continuity, because any disaster that we face is just one in an unfolding chain of disasters. And if the intention of these programs is to improve resilience to disaster, then a key thing is seeing it as one more step in a journey of resilience. And we see that, as we talked about, if you're going to have a pre-existing framework that lets you move more quickly after every disaster and progressively move the housing stock, continuity to a future policy and program, keeping the databases open, keeping the material on record, knowing which houses had what forms of intervention, knowing what happened to the people who moved, so that you can then see at the next disaster, are they in a salient or better place? What can we learn? So as part of that, we see this as shifting from post-disaster recovery, which is what we often see, and that's when governments realize, oh, we need to do something to help people recover. If we keep these programs going, and indeed Hurricane Sandy, a raft of something like 9 or 12 programs was implemented, and they are still ongoing today, sort of something like 12 years later. So that idea that we shift from post-disaster recovery to pre-disaster mitigation. I'd just like to think about some future considerations. This is actually a photo we've taken of some buyback. But so we set this reporter up around key future considerations that may be helpful for those of you working with resilient programs. So one is this issue of continuity allows a very timely response during recovery, and timeliness during recovery is important. It also allows a shift from recovery to mitigation. As part of that, maintaining rapid access to the knowledge, data, and procedures to help you get people registered and enrolled in programs. Understanding that it can never be perfect for everybody, and what are the trade-offs, and are you shifting, for example, over time from a more individualistic approach to get people familiar with this, and then moving towards a zoning approach, a collective approach. That may be a sort of decision, but understanding there are trade-offs there. Ensuring both eligibility, but also equity of access, and understanding that equity may mean additional measures bolted on to help those who are less able to take advantage. And finally, incentivizing and supporting the target population. If our aim is to help them become more resilient, we find that there are lots of other reasons that are social, emotional, and financial that may impact their ability to uptake the program, and that those things could benefit from additional interventions to improve your outcomes. And so just, to think about this, every program is different, but our evaluative framework and our report is intended to give some nuanced guidance about that, to think about multiple success factors beyond how many houses had an intervention, and to think about tracking that over the long term and moving from post-disaster to pre-disaster. But I'd like to kind of stop there. That's been quite a lot of information, hopefully helpful, and you can look at more in the report, to just maybe move to our end users at QRA, and to ask both Veena and Sam how they see this framework resonating with their experiences, and if there are any elements that are particularly salient for them. And look, let me stop sharing at that space so that we can see the others and hear from them. And obviously, Katie, who has joined me, is more than happy to take all your most difficult questions about what I just presented. It was a whirlwind tour of a lot of stuff.
Dan, are you able to share your perspectives on this first piece of work from Paula and her team?
I am, Nicola. Yeah, thank you. And yeah, apologies all. Veena's in the midst of some technical difficulties, so I'll speak on behalf of Queensland Reconstruction Authority. So I guess from QRA's perspective, we wanted to touch quickly on the voluntary home buyback program and provide you all with a high-level overview of the program itself. And then we wanted to speak to the framework directly and how its future considerations align with how Resilient Homes Fund and the VHBB program specifically have been delivered. So with regards to the voluntary home buyback, voluntary home buyback is a part of the Resilient Homes Fund, which is jointly funded by the Australian and Queensland governments under Category D, Extraordinary Assistance Measures of the Disaster Recovery Funding Arrangements, acronyms DRFA. So the voluntary home buyback program was established to help homeowners who had been severely impacted by the 2022 floods and were at high risk of future flooding in the future. Under the VHBB program, the relevant council purchases properties using program funds from the Queensland and Australian governments. The program is voluntary, providing homeowners with the opportunity to sell a flood-prone and flood-damaged property at a pre-flood price, which would not otherwise have been available to them. The program has enabled homeowners to have a choice and another avenue to move forward with recovery. The primary purpose of the program was to ensure that impacted homeowners do not suffer the same devastating, life-threatening impacts of flooding again. So under the program, 859 offers were ultimately presented to homeowners, with 685 offers being accepted, and all 685 of those accepted contracts have now settled, allowing impacted residents to move on following the flood event. These offers were presented to homeowners across a variety of councils, which were Brisbane, Ipswich, Logan, Sunshine Coast, Fraser Coast, Gympie, Moreton Bay, Lockyer Valley, Goondiwindi, Somerset, Gold Coast, and Noosa. On 18th of June 2023, it was announced additional homeowners at high risk of flooding had been identified to participate under an expanded buyback program. The expansion enabled the identification of an additional 300 properties, bringing the total identified to 981 properties. Once all properties were identified, applications for the buyback program closed on the 18th of June 2023. Registrations for the remaining programs under the Resilient Homes Fund, namely Resilient Retrofit and Home Raising, were closed on the 30th of July 2023. Once purchased by council, the property is then demolished or removed, and the land is rezoned to a non-occupied use, To date, 593 properties have been demolished or removed. Work is also continuing under the RHF program options, Home Raising and Resilient Retrofit, which is managed by the Department of Housing and Public Works. And Sam will be able to give you a quick brief on those elements later. So under the DRFA, all RHF program expenditure must be complete by the 30th of June 2026. So now I just wanted to touch on, I guess, the similarities between the framework and RHF and the buyback program specifically. So from QRA, we feel that the framework and its identified future considerations are directly relevant to Resilient Homes Fund. Whilst an ongoing program similar to RHF is unlikely to be established in the near future, QRA has and will continue to share its learnings with RHF to the Department of Housing and Public Works, and outside of RHF via the New South Wales Reconstruction Authority, who are currently delivering their Northern Rivers program. We have also undertaken extensive effort to document our many processes and procedures and lessons learnt to ensure a ready-made program could be activated at short notice should the need occur in the future. Undertaking the Resilient Homes Fund Monitoring and Evaluation Project is also another way that we are doing our best to ensure future iterations of RHF or RHF-like works can commence with a significant understanding of how RHF is being delivered today. Given Resilient Homes Fund was a revolutionary DRFA program, it was designed at an individual home-by-home approach to ensure equity across the board, regardless of an individual's personal circumstances. It's important to note that the voluntary home buyback program process was applied consistently to all participants in the program. Eligibility criteria was council specific, and they individually contributed to the development and establishment process of that criteria. The buyback program was developed with a rigorous valuations framework, which ensures transparency and fairness for all homeowners. The same independent valuer was used across all local government agencies, with the exception of Brisbane City Council, which managed valuations in its own council area. A robust internal process was also adopted by QRA to review all valuations prior to the offers being issued. All homeowners under the buyback program received 2 valuations of their property from an independent valuer, a pre-flood value and a current market value. Presenting 2 valuations ensured that homeowners received a fair price for their home. Every homeowner was also given the opportunity to undertake their own independent valuation of their own individual properties should they wish to appeal the valuation offered to them by government. So regarding equity differences, a range of support options were made available to the cohort of RHF applicants, such as financial help towards temporary accommodation, service navigators to support applicants undertake the process of works, legal help, financial advice, and emotional and practical support. And outside of these support services, Resilient Homes Fund itself facilitated dozens of community engagement sessions all over Southeast Queensland that enabled local homeowners to visit and ask questions directly to RHF staff on all aspects of program delivery. So I acknowledge that's a very short and sharp overview of the buyback program and some similarities, but yeah, I hope that provides a bit more understanding. And if there's any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That's really helpful that you provided all of that background information too on how the program's running. I'd like to hand over to Sam. And Sam, I'll just remind you, Paula's questions to you and Dan were, how does this framework resonate with your own experiences? And what, if any, elements seem particularly salient?
Thanks, Nicola. And thanks, Dan, for that brief overview of the Resilient Homes from the QRA's perspective. The Department of Housing and Public Works administers the building aspects of the Resilient Homes Fund, so namely the raise and retrofit programs. In general, we've got quite a few properties in train, and it's certainly the largest scale that we've seen this sort of activity in Australia. It is a nation-leading program across the whole. Our side of the fund administers home raising, which provides up to $150,000 of incentive funding to help raise habitable areas above the level of flood risk or where the floods went in 2022. Similarly, the Resilient Retrofit program provides $50,000 to help change existing areas to make them more resilient to flooding. The RHF program has evolved over as it's been stood up, and I think it's one of the first points I wanted to touch on in relation to this idea of a feedback loop. And I think it's something that we've actually heard really good feedback about from our homeowners, that we have listened and we have actually responded to some of the needs. Some of these are there was the threshold increase for the home raise program to help more people get through that. Given the cost of construction, particularly after COVID, the original grant funding was for $100,000, for example. There are also some key learnings based on the Brisbane City Council program that were able to be incorporated into standing the RHF up, and also the technical advice sought in the ongoing implementation of the fund. Another thing I think I wanted to touch on was this idea of a framework. And one of the things I think I would argue from our side of things was the importance of a risk-based approach. We've had a huge effort in collating data from local governments and from other experts to actually help homeowners empower themselves to understand how risk is applied to their home directly. So, for example, a floor level survey was done for thousands of houses within the Resilient Homes Fund to help understand how high it went in 2022. People know they know their house, but how high the floods could actually go in another scenario. Every flood is different, and that helps people understand how to build back in a better way. And I'd argue that would be important in any sort of framework going forward, acknowledging that this is a disaster, post-disaster response. And one of the things I think, touching on the equity point that Dan was also talking about, is that we are still seeing people that are very vulnerable. Disasters are difficult and hard personally, financially, but also the disruption that is caused can lead to a lot of trauma. And we've learnt ways of helping to stand up our building program to help people get over the line through an inevitably complex process that is building and construction. One of those ways is the case management approach that we stood up in the Resilient Homes Fund, which is actually putting one person as a liaison officer to help people have one point of contact within the department and build a sense of trust, but helping people step through each step by step through both the fund and the application in itself, but also through the steps with their builder and any of the other experts and professionals that they need to work with to make their house more resilient. We also have a accommodation support program to help people live in a caravan or some alternative form of accommodation while the works are underway. Dan touched on that as well as an important aspect of technical support where we're able to draw expertise from expert architects and others alike to actually help people understand what resilience means. This is a new way of building. One of the complications I think that we've found is that there is no standard for flood resilience in the country. Although the QRA, for example, has done some amazing work in producing guides, these are by no means standardized across the board to the point of a regulation or a building code, and that can provide complexities in how industry understands how to rebuild after a flood or to prepare for one beforehand. I wanted to touch on the individual approach and the idea that every home is different and every place is different, and we have found that across the board. The Raise and Retrofit program works across southern Queensland between very urban areas in the city and then remote areas as well, and we see very different houses, very different flood risk, and very different personal circumstances. And I think that's something that needs to be taken into account. as well as working across all levels of government and industry. The builders that you have, for example, in Brisbane are very different to the ones that you would have more remotely. Lastly, I just wanted to touch on the sort of practical approach. We are working in building, and we do know that resilience works. We've received really lovely feedback from homeowners that have been affected in this most recent event in Alfred. And one of them was on, for example, the 7:30 report last week, who's had their house raised. And so, look, raising a house or retrofitting can work, and we have seen houses that have gone through this most recent event come out much better on the other side, and that's what we're all about as we continue to roll this program out. Dan touched on the Resilient Homes Fund is closed to new registrations. However, we are continuing to roll out the fund for our existing registrants through this year and into next. Thank you.
Really appreciate that, and really appreciate you sharing with us the fact that some of the participants in the program are noticing, increases in their resilience with the most recent event. That's really good news, and I'm sure something that the research team would be very interested in learning more about. So appreciate that. We might just go to some questions now for the panel. I'd like to ask the first question, if that's okay, to Paula. The report that you've done so far highlights the benefits of continuing policy. So how can Australia build a long-term resilience framework rather than, responding to each disaster event or each event individually?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really important point, and in some ways, Sam's already spoken to that a bit in pointing out that because, unfortunately for us, we're a little bit like North Carolina was in the late 1990s, where we're having repeat events, maybe not all at the same scale, but what that is giving us is a chance to see what's been working for who. And so we can sort of feed that in so some of it is we're already getting feedback loops. That's helpful. And so I think that's one of the key things. The next thing is keeping some form of, if we now go to drought and bushfire, it's important that we don't lose this knowledge. So I appreciate that there is some investment in maintaining databases and customer relationship management systems, because that's what they are, CRM. But a lot of work is also going into these flood portals and things to have better knowledge of flood in different areas. What we need is some level of seeing that as a line in a standard part of the budget and the disaster resilient approach that is being taken, that we keep those databases maintained, that we know what's happened to every house, and that so that we can easily reactivate or go back and know which houses had what done, as well as knowing something about, we now know a great deal about the different ways that flood affects houses. Based on these widespread floods, which also came from different ways of flooding, that we maintain those databases. And a lot of work's gone in this recovery and resilience program to developing that. I'd love to see that we maintain that data so that it's very easy, for example, for someone to come in next time and say, A, let's activate it. We know what we've got. And B, we already know that we can use this to evaluate what happened last time.
Yeah. Lovely. Thanks. Thank you, Paula. We've got a really interesting question here too regarding the framework and whether it's considered the scenario of limited program funding. Yeah. And I wondered whether that's something that you might be able to address in terms of when the eligibility and equity can see a greater number of participants than there is available budget to help. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, look, honestly, from an emotional perspective, this is one of the heartbreaking things, but this is, I think, where equity also kicks in. There will always be some limits to program funding. We are on a long-term journey in any of these countries we looked at of moving people away from disaster, and that can't all be done in a single budgetary intervention. But some places also simply this is what we've got, and that's where equity can play an important role of saying, okay, so those who would be less likely to be able to find some way to lift themselves up, do we target them? Do we try to target the most affected who are also the most vulnerable? And there are trade-offs there. And there are also, so in that sense, we might even need a further trade-off that we haven't mentioned, but this is a very good question, because it's like, where is the greatest good going to be done? And that's a very thorny moral question, but it's also a question that, policy needs to engage with, which is, do we say, okay, those are the ones that are at such high risk of exposure, the only thing that would be valuable is buyback. So any kind of raising or retrofit measures should really be for something else. And, those should only be for buyback. So there's these kinds of decisions which we're going to need to make. And I'm grateful for that question, because if we keep dribbling these programs out over time, it may be that we don't have a big sum of money, but we've always got a little bit, and we can say, well, we've kind of zoned, we're going to keep using that little bit of money to keep making this group a little bit better over time.
Yeah.
Appreciate
so
the question.
we're getting the best out of the funds that are made available. Yeah. It's interesting. There's another question here that I think Sam has somewhat answered when he spoke about the fact that there's no standard for flood resilience building really in Queensland. The question is, how do you validate a property as resilient? Yeah, is there a rating system? Sam, did you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, I am an architect, so I'll always look at this from a design point of view, but also we talk about efficacy, I suppose, which is did it flood? Was it able to be cleaned out, and was someone able to get back in sooner and avoid some of the issues like mold, for example? Look, there is no clear rating system, particularly for what we call resilient retrofit. There is a large body of work that has been produced in Queensland since the 2011 floods, but the short answer is no. Queensland is kind of leading the way from a flood point of view, particularly, for example, the QRA guide I mentioned earlier. However, there is no standard, no, and that provides complications, obviously, when you think about the insurance industry, but also how to build. So, for example, part of RHF was a large industry and community education program to actually help not just homeowners understand what resilience was, but builders as well.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate that response. Paula, you mentioned trade-offs a lot in your presentation. How do you see those play out in Australia as we try to build more resilient housing stock?
Yeah, look, I think that is an important problem. I mean, we're facing a whole lot of trade-offs in Australia because, as you know, and you've probably seen in the recent ABC News, people are also critical about the fact that we have had some building in places that are not that we already know are flood prone areas. So we've also got trade-offs around things to do with affordable housing and, legacy assets versus new assets being built. So I see this issue of trade-offs as maybe a valuable way to think through a sequence of decisions we need to make about, short-term and long-term issues of getting people moved away from areas, of changing policies, and of thinking about those whom we can make a material benefit to and what other things we might need to plug in. I think that came up as well very much in some of the points that were made by both Dan and Sam about these individual differences and things, that now that we've learnt a lot from programs like this, where we've dealt individually, maybe we can kind of bring that knowledge together into a decision tree that says, well, people who have these kinds of houses and these kinds of vulnerabilities, we want to target them in this way. We can take a more collective approach. We can, direct this set of resources to them. Those other people, we're gonna share the costs with them or something like that. So I sort of see a world where we come up with some sort of dialogue about the trade-offs we're going to have to make in order to make the best use of the money we've got. And I mean, Katie, is there anything more that I know we discussed this a lot in the team because we see it as very valid.
Yeah, I was just going to add in that I think there's all sorts of complex issues around why people perhaps have chosen not to participate at this point in time. And I think that's a really important sort of group of people to have in mind when we think about how far the budget extends, who we might target next time, who we might need to stay in touch with and keep those conversations going with. We've already recognised them as being at risk. So I think we do need to sort of keep in mind through all of these things, those kind of mobilisation and things that prevent people from participating.
Thanks, Katie and Paula. I've got a question here specifically for Dan, if that's okay, Dan. There's a question that's come up in the thread. Are there any guarantees or rules in place to ensure the council bought back land? Although I don't think it's council bought back. Hopefully you can clarify. To ensure that the land that is bought back cannot be rezoned in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola, and thank you for the question. So council purchases. Sorry, correction. Yeah, council does purchase the land from the homeowner,
Okay.
so it is land that's owned by council moving forward. But with every DRFA program, there's a document developed known as the guidelines, which is I guess the Bible of what you can and can't do with in the context of that program. It determines scope and eligible and ineligible expenditure and all that kind of stuff. Part of the guidelines for the voluntary owned buyback, it made it very clear that there is a requirement that the land that's purchased under the buyback scheme is rezoned to unoccupied green use. That's just a term. Every council essentially has their own planning scheme. And it's a requirement that they undertake what is known as a minor amendment to that planning scheme to ensure that those specific land parcels are rezoned effectively so that there is not an opportunity to develop dwellings on that land in the future. Thankfully, the vast majority of the houses to date have already been rezoned to an effective zoning adjustment. But as all the councils have a staggered delivery scope, they're just some of the more regional councils are still going through that process. But if the land wasn't rezoned, the full quantum of scope for the program would be achieved, and there would be a risk of the funding being eligible for the council to utilise. So it is made very clear that it is a requirement of the scope to rezone the land. Yeah, very good question. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. I just wanted to share a comment that's come up for the recording within the Q&A. Moving forward, there's a great opportunity to build greater training and collaboration on creating more resilient practices for the building industry, and I think everybody on the panel today would agree with that one. But I've got a question here for Paula. It's a big question, Paula. How do we balance out resilient construction and housing affordability?
Well, that's a great question. Whoever asked that, I'd love to ask you what you think we should do. But I do want to say some things, right? So, I mean, one of the things that we do know is that when we build in a place so we know we have a problem at the moment with sufficient affordable housing. And so, this housing demand. But if we build housing that is affordable in places that we know are already at risk of these kinds of damage and loss, we're basically saying to those who are lower socioeconomic and need affordable housing that it's okay for you to go in places that we don't think are safe. And so if we really take that headline view to the policy, and I'm not saying anyone would, because I mean, everyone thinks, well, but it's a good thing, right? I'm making houses for people and people need houses. But if that's the house that's going to see them stressed and flooded, or see their roof blown off, or see their house burnt down in 8 years, just as they started to make a bit of inroads into their mortgage, we're not really helping them. So in that sense, I think we need that short and long-term notion of trade-off as well. And to keep our eyes on the bigger prize, which is a more resilient Australia going forward. There is a lot of research, and I mean, it's a bit varied, but it shows that $1 spent on resilience, saves you, varied prices from up to $16 in future recovery. So every dollar we spend on making a really resilient place now, and I know that resilient building is often more expensive, and building in places that are adapted to the positions may be more expensive, is actually going to save us all money down the road, as well as, a lot of trauma and disruption to everyday life, which is also a cost to Australia. We want happy communities of people who thrive. So yeah, I'd answer the question that way, and hope we can all support policymakers who want to do that.
Thanks, Paula. That's great. I'll go to our last question because time is moving on. But this one is for Dan. Someone's asked, they're interested in the operation of buyback programs, especially rollouts for strata property. Would you like to provide a response to that, Dan, from the voluntary house buyback perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Nicola, and thanks, Nick, I believe it was, who asked the question. So, yeah, with regards to strata property or strata titles, there are several strata properties that are in scope for the buyback program. I guess the primary challenge was for strata, there was a requirement that there was 100% commitment by the entire home ownership cohort. So let's say, for example, it was a strata of 20 units. We required registration of all 20 homeowners requesting buyback. So this has occurred, and both the correction, one's occurred in Ipswich with the Mill Street property. I believe that was about 20 odd units. That has successfully gone through the program, and the strata property has already been demolished. As some of you may have heard in the media, the Myhigh Grove complex continues to undergo the buyback process. 42 units within that strata title. 40 homeowners have committed and signed up to the buyback program, and all 40 of those settlement contracts have been completed. The final 2 homeowners, those properties are going through a compulsory acquisition process at this time. So whilst there was interest from a variety of strata titles across the state, the requirement of having 100% commitment limited, I guess, the opportunity for some of those strata titles to actually proceed with buyback, as it was a requirement. It's a voluntary. You know, we Queensland government can't be seen as trying to encourage or influence homeowners to sell their property. It had to be a voluntary commitment. So if we didn't get the 100%, unfortunately, it wasn't deemed eligible. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Dan. And our great team in the background are going to share a couple of resources with you that Paula has provided to us today from former work that Paula's done in this space. So I encourage you all to have a look at those resources. We're going to thank and acknowledge the efforts of Paula, Katie, Veena, Dan and Sam, who've taken the time to join us today for this webinar. And a big thank you to all of you who joined us online and for submitting some really interesting questions to the panel. My apologies, we can't get to all of them, but we are limited by time. The recording of the webinar will be online next week, and you'll receive an email with a link to the recording, but also you'll receive a link to a new hazard note for this project and this particular deliverable for this project, alongside with information about our upcoming hazardous webinars. So I'm just going to give a bit of a plug for what we've got coming up. Our next webinar will be on the 29th of April, where we'll discuss our research with the University of Melbourne, helping Powerlink Queensland identify high-risk locations across their power transmission network. We're also really excited for the Natural Hazards Research Forum, which is on in Adelaide this year from the 18th to the 20th of June. It's shaping up to be a fantastic 3 days of discussion, and we hope to see you there. Registrations are open now via our website. And for updates of everything Natural Hazards Research Australia, please sign up to our newsletter, and you can follow us on social media as well. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.